This is Process and Reality, the only officially unofficial guide to reading Alfred North Whitehead. I'm your host, Tyler Davis. Welcome to the show. All right, so welcome back to the show. We're going to pick back up on page 5. Wanted to split this section up because it's a little bit difficult, and to be honest, he's a little bit all over the place. He is following a train of thought, but he's a bit like we said. There's not as much proof editing in this book as we would like, so we have to make a few kind of edits on our own as we continue through it. I'm sure any serious Whitehead people would die with the liberties that we're taking with this text, but I think Whitehead himself would be appreciative of it. And I think that the fact that this discipline has not enjoyed as much wide exposure as we would like is due to this fact. It's due to the fact that we have not made his work intelligible. We've made it more opaque. So I'm a popularizer. I want to popularize this and give it to the people. And you were the first people. All right, so Whitehead gives us a definition of philosophic generalization, using specific ideas applied to a restricted group of facts to arrive at general ideas which apply to all facts. In other words, induction. He's going to be real repetitive on induction. Induction. Generalization is induction. Certain people are partially rational and irrational when it comes to the process of generalizing. They are thoroughly rational when they deal with the internal discipline at hand, like, say, a particle physicist doing particle physics. But when they try to deal with something outside of their discipline, they're unable to think more broadly, and then they double down into dogmatism. So just an example of this, you might be kind of skeptical of this, but just think about a few things with me. Think about the divide between science and religion. Now think about the divide between the humanities, social sciences, and physical sciences, and biological sciences, and how each of them define themselves in opposition to each other in many cases. Now think about the things that various people tend to become incredibly deterministic about, nature versus nurture debates, or statements like all the sciences will be explained one day by physics or by chemistry or by neuroscience. These external dogmatisms manifest a kind of irrationality, an inability to generalize beyond a limited and strict framework into a framework that is flexible to account for different facets of life. So in other words, you see this where people get caught up in their own discipline. They're able to be brilliant within the framework of their own discipline, and then as soon as they exit that discipline, they are as dogmatic as a religious fundamentalist. I'm sure plenty of examples come to mind, so we don't really need to call out any names here. Supply that gap with whoever you want. So next we move on to the second condition for imaginative construction. We want to pursue the two rational ideals of coherence and logical perfection. Now, the logical perfection that we are seeking is supposed to be in line with the history of mathematics. Like we said, that's never ending, but not futile. The coherence we're after is going to preserve our sanity. We can't be hypocritical, okay? So just if you're a hypocritical person, you probably don't know it. But you're not allowed to be hypocritical in metaphysics. You can't require coherence, that is to say internal logic and consistency from others and not from yourself, okay? By using appeals and special pleading, that's double-minded thinking. Quite literally, it's insane. Okay, so what's going to keep our sanity in this process is coherence, applying it to ourselves. Logical contradictions are the largest problem in these systems of thought, with the exception being temporary slips of the mind. And that happens a lot. Okay, so we have to give fair leeway for temporary slips of the mind. But in general, Whitehead says people don't disband from a system of thought because of illogicalities alone. And I think this is really true. This is true. The system becomes inadequate to illustrate human experience, and they become incoherent with human experience. So you have a system, and some philosophical ideas or schools of thought, they fail to include an obvious element of human experience, and then they boldly deny that the experience is true or real instead of modifying their system. So if you grew up in a religious framework, this is everywhere. You adopt a Calvinistic, Puritan kind of framework, and you apply it super rigidly, and it really can apply to everything if you force it into the framework, but it really does cut out elements of human experience. Now, an extreme example of this idea is like outside of philosophy is the fact that there are like flat earthers with PhDs, right? There are people who supposedly are educated. They have systems of thought that boldly deny like universally experienced phenomena. Or another example, this would be like Holocaust deniers. While this idea or school of thought is popular or novel, everyone kind of puts up with it or ignores the idea's inadequacies and incoherence. So flat earthers are out there, and we all say, those flat earthers, they're crazy. And we kind of put up with it, right? Whatever. But say that problematic system of thought becomes the orthodox school of thought. It becomes mandated that they teach that in all schools. They teach it with authority despite its shortcomings. Well, people are going to begin to criticize that much more harshly. We often find the orthodox school of thought intolerable because it's in denial of reality and incoherent. So we react strongly to it and we rebel. And this is, I think this is what you're seeing with the rise of the quote nuns. A lot of the followers of the Facebook page are non-identifying in terms of religion. It's by and large the growing number of people who they don't necessarily identify as atheist, but they're not religious, and they don't ascribe to any sort of systematization for their beliefs because most belief systems cut out some element of human experience. So I think that this is just a direct kind of assessment of that kind of dynamic that was going on in his own day, but is still going on. So after people start criticizing it more harshly and there's a reaction that people take, the reason a system of thought becomes incoherent is that somewhere along the line, someone arbitrarily disconnected one or more of the metaphysical first principles from the data. Our experiences are necessarily tied to whatever the metaphysical first principles are. We're speaking very elliptically about the metaphysical first principles, but we have to assume that they're connected to us. Otherwise, they are not metaphysical first principles. Whatever it is that makes up the baseline of reality is connected to us. And so if a system of thought is in denial of our experiences, it's in denial of these metaphysical first principles in some way, shape, or form. So Descartes illustrates this because he arbitrarily made a mind-body dualism where there's no reason why there should not be a one-substance world, either body or mind. This is actually a common criticism of Descartes. Why does there have to be a dualism or duality, substance dualism? A lot of people prefer substance dualism. I don't think they're in the majority, but there's certainly a group that prefers that and prefers the problems of substance dualism to the problems of other philosophical schools. That's not going to be us here. So Spinoza's philosophy, on the other hand, is attractive to Whitehead because he modified Descartes into coherence. Spinoza starts with one substance, which is self-generating, and elaborates the substance's essential attributes and individual modes. My best guess at the Latin here is the feelings which self-define. Alfred North Whitehead says a multiplicity of modes is necessary in Spinoza's scheme for it to remain relevant, but it threatens to be incoherent because it also is arbitrarily introduced. The modes are arbitrarily introduced. This might be a little bit opaque. If you're not familiar with these two philosophers, listen to the Philosophize This episodes on them. They're excellent overviews of their thought. It'll probably make a little bit more sense. The philosophy of organism, or process philosophy, is close to Spinoza. But Alfred North Whitehead says where he and Spinoza part ways, the sharpest is over the subject-predicate forms of thought. And we're going to get more into that later, but basically Whitehead rejects the presupposition that this form of thought and speech is a direct embodiment or accurate reflection of reality in speech or thought patterns. As a result of avoiding this presupposition, Whitehead avoids the substance quality problem and replaces the morphological description with a description of dynamic process. Now, morphology is a branch of biology dealing with the study of the form and structure of organisms and their specific structural features. So morphology is a branch of life science dealing with the study of gross structure of an organism or taxon with its component parts. Essentially, Whitehead replaces a static idea of what is fixed and primary plus its auxiliary parts, as one would do when studying animals or plant life, when you'd say, oh, well, this is a mammal, and then you'd further define as if mammal is a fixed category. Instead, he's replacing that with a sketch of process itself, not with substance. Whitehead changes Spinoza's modes into what he calls sheer actualities. When we analyze a sheer actuality, our understanding of a sheer actuality increases, but this doesn't lead us into any higher grade of reality. So in other words, there is one reality and many levels to our understanding of that reality. The coherence that Spinoza's system displays, which Whitehead wants to preserve, is the idea that Spinoza discovered is that the process by which any one actual entity of experience involves the other actual entities of experience in its own becoming or actuality. Did that make sense? That was a little bit dense right there. Basically, we want to talk about being and becoming and how a quote individual involves all other quote individuals in the process of its own becoming. That's a simplified version of what we said right there. Don't hold me to some sort of rigid, well, you said this or that. I'm trying to break this down for you so that's easier to digest, and all truths are half truths. So we'll sketch out the more of the details as time goes on. But essentially, Whitehead refers to this process of becoming, the individual becoming, and involving all other individuals in the process of its becoming, is synonymously called concrescence. Becoming, concrescence, process, those are kind of synonymous terms. Concrescence is more specifically referring to this process of the one involving the many in its next becoming. Actual entities and actual occasions are the same. You need to just remember these are events of experience. You and I and animals and plants and atoms and all sorts of things are actual occasions. Experience goes all the way down. We're going to unpack this concept further, but for now you can place yourself where it says actual occasion or entity, although this is not necessarily limited to you, okay? We're looking for something that is not entirely egocentric and anthrocentric. We can explain the obvious solidarity of the world by this concept of concrescence. Now we're going to make a hard turn here and talk about God. It's not so much of a hard turn when you understand the philosophy more, but in terms of how it's written, it's very abrupt. So brace yourself. In all philosophy, there's an ultimate, okay? God or ground of being or force or other notion like this. The ultimate is actual in virtue of its accidents. So An accident in philosophy is an attribute that may or may not belong to a subject without affecting its essence. So in philosophy, potentiality and actuality are a pair of closely connected principles. Aristotle used these to analyze motion, causality, ethics, all this stuff. It's in Nicomachean Ethics and De Anima. Yeah, so potentiality, actuality, they're a pair of closely allied principles. While the ultimate might have all sorts of potential manifestations, reality points back towards what is the actual ultimate by looking at its accidental qualities. So, for instance, if someone said, you could be a painter, or a Subway worker, or a billionaire, but all your pay stubs come from Subway, and you wear a Subway uniform, it would be evident that you are actually a Subway worker. It's not essential to your being or your humanness that Subway pays you or that you wear the stupid hat. But both of these facts point backwards to the fact that you indeed are a Subway worker in reality. And whatever you might otherwise potentially be, this is what you are actually. That's a very crude example, but in more philosophical terms, no one's essence precedes their existence, not even God's or the universe's. Our actuality is determined by our becoming into our essence, not by what we are or were in some true pure core. So, in all philosophy, the ultimate is only capable of characterization through its accidental, that is to say, non-essential embodiments. Apart from these non-essentials, the ultimate would be devoid of actuality and would remain purely potential. Let me unpack this for a little bit. In this philosophy, we're going to call the ultimate creativity. God is creativity's primordial, meaning existing from the beginning of time or eternally, non-temporal, meaning non-aging or synonymous with the last term. He's kind of just using, Whitehead kind of stacks terms sometimes that are just synonymous. Accident, so accidental embodiment of creativity. God in the philosophy of organism characterizes the ultimate. We understand the ultimate through God. Whitehead contrasts that in the monistic or one substance systems like Spinoza's or absolute idealism, the ultimate is God. And that ultimate usually is referred to as the absolute. A lot of more mystic Islamic faith refers to God as the absolute as well. And I think Tillich also. This ultimate is given a final eminent reality beyond how these systems describe the accidents. In other words, in Spinoza's system and absolute idealism, God is more real than his accidents. Generally speaking, Whitehead's philosophy is more like some kinds of Indian or Chinese thought than Western Asiatic or European thought then, because he doesn't believe that God is more real than his accidents. God is just as real as all of his accidental qualities, and creativity is just as real as all of the accidental qualities like God and us. So there's no higher grade of reality. God doesn't exist outside of what is. One side makes process ultimate, and that would be Whitehead. The other side makes fact ultimate, which are the systems where the absolute is God. Well, if that didn't hurt your brain yet, I don't know what else will. You probably need a little bit of a break to get some coffee and some water, and then we'll continue on with section 3, episode 5.